Um, Before I get started, I did want to also just real quick note that we have a special guest, so to speak. Sorry, I'm going to call you out. Clay Bush, our new county archaeologist, is here this evening. He's moved here and has joined us, and I'm hoping eventually. I'm trying to convince him he should come give a talk one of these days. So he says he's trying to learn a little bit more of the Sarasota County history and things so that he can come up with a good topic to present. So, but he came down tonight to meet you all and check this out. Um, Ultimately, I put this lecture together originally as a class when I was a professor at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, mostly as an effort to draw students into anthropology, just to get them interested in the subject. So I basically have taken a short summer course and tried to cram it down into a talk tonight. There is far more fun and fiction than fact in this, but we're going to, do a little anthropology, a little movieology, and just have some fun. So let's see, where do I go here? I don't need this. There we go. So we're going to foray into cultural anthropology for a minute and some history. Every culture has transitions, from women becoming mature, getting married, transitioning to death, women losing the ability to have babies, confirmation, quinceañeras, right? And a lot of these events have ceremonies surrounding them. And these ceremonies are incredibly important for the event to be successful, right? And death is one of these same transitions. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'll do my best to stand still. That's a tall order. So death is a transition from the realm of the living to the beyond. And that's sort of where we're getting at with the zombies. Zombies ultimately are classically defined as a dead person who has been cursed and raised from the dead by a sorcerer, a witch, or a shaman to work as a slave. That is the true origin. It comes from Haitian superstition and religion, primarily voodoo, but there's several variants of this. It comes from a number of words. The exact origin is actually not known. So really the origin of the word is clouded in pretty much just as much mystery as the concept of what is a zombie. So the whole thing is a big gray area. But there's obviously French, West Indian, African, and then Haitian in the South, the Caribbean island areas. The voodoo religion seems to have come from the African continent and came over with those that were brought through the slave trade. The French slave operations were incredibly brutal, and they rarely took the time to actually re-educate their slaves, which is something that was sometimes done in other countries. And so they would pick up bits and pieces of the Catholic religion through their exposure to those that were overseeing them, and in ways combined that with their own religions in their new homes. But it was kept very secret, obviously. It wasn't welcome out in the public, so to speak. So zombies really are a manifestation of a fear based on the combination of cultural and religious beliefs. So many African cultures view ill health or bad luck as the result of an outside force. So somebody has cursed you for some reason. Usually you have not fulfilled some sort of social obligation or violated a social norm. And then these Africans were enslaved and brought into the sugar mills and plantations of the Caribbean. And then they're exposed to the Catholic religion. And so we had the African component of sorcerers, which is shamans, and then the Catholic component of rising from the dead and eternal life. And ultimately, zombies initially represented the fear of, instead of getting eternal life and going to heaven and freedom, being bound to slavery for eternity. So instead of dying, you would be raised from the dead and forced to work forever, is essentially how this origin story begins. Voodoo really does come to the forefront, though, during the slave rebellion in Haiti, and it becomes more widely known, so to speak, although it's often overlooked as superstition. But during the American Revolution and things, this superstition was weaponized, and they started speculating about voodoo, and in particular these freed Black people who were down south and could corrupt the minds of ours, and they focused a lot on animal worship and discussed the potential for human sacrifice, and cannibalism came out of this. There was a trial in 1836 in which there was proof of voodoo and vandalism and cannibalism. There was a skull in a jar that was filled with stew that had been made by the priest. But the bodies of the priests disappeared overnight after they were killed, supposedly because they themselves became zombies and rose from the dead. And so there are numerous accounts of the dead rising and the word zombie, but the word zombie really doesn't appear until almost 1929. Sadly, the link between cannibalism and Haiti has continued to persist for nearly 2 centuries now. In 1986, the Journal of the American Medical Association, a scientific and widely respected journal, linked the stories of cannibalistic practices in New York's Haitian population to the AIDS outbreak in the community, instead of commenting on the impacts of sexual tourism between the U.S. and the Caribbean. So linking Haiti, cannibalism, voodoo to a widespread epidemic. And even just last year, a particular set of Haitian immigrants were accused of eating cats and dogs. So we are still lumping that in to this day. So let's sidetrack into cannibalism for a hot second here. Cannibalism does have origins in tribal rituals of honoring the dead. You consume your loved one to show respect and keep them with you, or warriors will eat those that they've killed to gain their strength. But human teeth are not designed to cut and tear meat or flesh. That's why we have silverware. So, and why we cook things, right? Our teeth are just not designed like dogs or other things. But I'm a bioarchaeologist and I know all about cannibalism, right? So how is that so? Because basically humans will process the human bone like animal bone. The bones will be butchered and cut. You will see hammer marks and percussion marks in an effort to break the bones open to get at the marrow on the inside, which is the meaty, valuable portion. And there's been various arguments for and against it, but ultimately there's pretty definitive proof of numerous instances of cannibalism in society for various reasons, ritualistic, necessity, etc. And there's also evidence of bones being cooked. You get pot polish from boiling, burning, and other things. So going all the way back to 850,000 years ago, Homo antecessor and or Homo erectus at Grandolina was eating each other, whether it was for ritual and honor or out of necessity, we don't know. Homo heidelbergensis in Africa, there's the famous incident with in Cowboy Wash in Colorado, in which two warring Native American groups were likely attacking each other. Jamestown, obviously, with early American colonization, and then infamously the Donner Party trying to continue west. However, in all instances, the bodies were prepared first. There was no chomping. They were all butchered or cooked or whatever. Okay, so back to the zombies. There are several documented instances of real zombies. Felicia, up here at the top picture, died in 1907, but was found alive in 1936. Zora Neale Hurston actually met her and interviewed her, but there's a lot of arguments that it may be a case of mistaken identity. She had a lot of mental health issues, and so they couldn't truly corroborate if it was her or not. Clovis Niçois was pronounced dead in the 1960s and was then found alive 18 years later. It is believed that he was poisoned by what they call zombie powder. He met with Wade Davis, who was a famous ethnobotanist who put together the whole tetrodotoxin pufferfish poison scenario. And he went on to live a second full life, got married, had kids, everything, even though he still had a death certificate. It was never voided. So in some ways, he truly was the living dead. Jacques was a physician who was poisoned with zombie powder, I believe by his wife or his wife's lover. He suffered hip dislocations. He was impervious to pain, trouble walking, his tongue rotted, his vision started to have problems, and he became very susceptible to suggestion. So you could convince him to do things. He recovered to some extent, but he suffered lifelong issues with it. And then the last one, I don't have the exact dates, but it was around the same time. This woman, Adeline, died, but her family could not bury her. And she was later found wandering, and apparently somebody had taken her and made her be a nanny as a zombie. But they ultimately figured out that she may have had epileptic seizures, which could have made her appear dead, and then ultimately resulted in her unconsciousness and her inability to form the memories and some of her other conditions. But there's not a lot of documentation on it. But all of these originate in Haiti or in the Caribbean islands, ultimately. So besides zombie powder, the good old puffer fish, how do we make a zombie? Little fun science fact, prior to 1950, death meant that your heart stopped. In 1968, death was redefined as brain death. And this was because of the invention of the ICU and the machines that can basically keep you alive and make your heart and lungs work. However, the first doctor that performed a heart transplant in 1960 was actually charged with murder because he took the heart out of a live patient and caused them to die. Even though they were brain dead, their heart was still technically pumping, and so they tried to accuse him of murder. But brain death is not as simple as you think, thanks to the many functions of the brain. We can have people in a very liminal state. So they aren't dead, but they aren't really alive, right? Which is essentially the definition of a zombie. There's numerous concepts around this. There's such things as social death, in which a person loses their social identity or their social connectedness. They may not be accepted as fully human by wider society. Some people can remove themselves from a society and essentially behave as a zombie. They're devoid of life and interactions. People can be made a zombie by social death from others, in which their family and maybe their entire village does not acknowledge their existence and just assumes, pretends, believes that they are dead, or the loss of social connection through illness. Some have argued with dementia patients and that they often die a social death long before they die a physical death because of this loss of social connections. Some mental disorders can remove your characteristics that make you more human, can remove your personality. Schizophrenia, severe depression, untreated epileptic seizures causing brain damage. And then there's always good old Thorazine, which was often caused, one of its namesake conditions is the zombie shuffle or the Thorazine shuffle, because they would sort of, as they walked around on this medication, because it basically comatoses you. And then there's the opportunity to swap identities. In some instances, a person dies, but they continue to live through another. It's often prearranged as a social agreement. So a son may assume the father's place, and he is just accepted as the father, right? So he just takes over his job or takes over his position. An uncle taking over for the brother that has passed away. It is a common occurrence in Haiti, and it's fairly easy in a lot of other countries to occur because of the limited record keeping opportunities and the fact that not everybody's fingerprinted or social security numbers, et cetera. And so there is some argument that some of the previous zombies were identity swaps or misidentifications. And then, of course, there's parasites, which thankfully so far we don't have to worry about too much. But the jewel wasp zombifies roaches to feed them to her young. This particular fungus grows on ants and turns them into zombies, and then uses them to propagate their own fungi, I don't know. And then Toxoplasmodius gonaди reduces the fear of cats in rats, and humans can actually become infected by it. And that's why they tell pregnant women not to change litter boxes and things so that you don't become infected, and it can compromise your immune system. And some have suggested that it can lead to schizophrenia or other conditions that result in a loss of inhibitions or reckless behavior. And so it might explain why crazy cat ladies live to serve their feline masters. So they might be a zombie to the cat overlords. I don't know, but fun fact. So we've got our zombies, right? Whether it's social identity or zombie powder or the cats, we want to keep them down. Again, those transitions that we talked about, this liminal state, when you die, we have all kinds of rituals surrounding it, right? Sometimes you must be buried within 24 hours in order to have you transition on in an appropriate way. Sometimes you need to go through an elaborate washing ritual and you cover the mirrors and you wear black. Sometimes the funeral process, right? In each culture, some people have to be buried. Some people want to be cremated. Some people have to be mummified and you have certain parts in or out in the jar or not. All of these things, have components to it. And we as a society actually have a whole entire set of people that handle this so that we don't have to, right? Coroners, medical examiners, funeral directors. And there's also obviously lots of taboos. And so zombies really fall into this liminal state. In a way, if these rituals aren't completed, a person runs the risk of not passing on and staying as a ghost or a zombie or something. So old school, bury people face down, right? Can't rise up backwards, last I checked. You can sew their mouth shut so that they can't answer their name when asked, because often the myth was that a sorcerer would call their name and they would say, yes, here I am, and then the sorcerer could control them. You provide distractions, such as an eyeless needle with thread, or seeds that they have to count so that they won't hear the sorcerer calling them. Sealed tombs or beneath bricks and structures. Some instances you stand guard until the body has decayed sufficiently. Bury the body near a busy street so that the sorcerer doesn't have enough time to go in and dig them up. Or you can kill them again, strangle them, poison them, shoot them, just to make sure they're good and dead, right? So I'm helping you all out in case the zombie apocalypse comes along. Just, keep it in mind. So can I prove this with archaeology? Sort of. Researchers have found evidence of vampire burials in Poland and throughout Europe. Often the burials include rocks in the mouth, rocks on top of the body, padlocks on the feet, or sickles on the neck so that when they rise up, it would take their head off. Again, they're often linked to vampires because we're in Europe, which is the origin of the vampire mythology. But I imagine that there would be very similar practices found in Haiti with efforts to keep individuals from rising, right? So either it's zombies or it's vampires, or they're just not very desirable people. Some analyses have found that those that were buried in these manners were very ill. They may have died very suddenly or of something very catastrophic, and the society was attempting to make sure that they didn't get up again to give it to anybody. They died suddenly and unexplained, or they were outsiders. So maybe they came into the village and literally died that night. And so, we can't trust them. We don't know. So we need to bury them in a way that they cannot get up again and harm us. So some kind of interesting things related to all of that. Now we have all the history. So let's talk about some movies, right? This is the fun stuff. How did zombies get to America? Or at least the story, travel stories, and a lot of unsubstantiated hearsay. Hearn in 1887 wrote an article for Harper Magazine about his trips to Martinique, the French colony, and he's the first word to bring. He first brought the word zombie, but it didn't really stick after he used it, and his description of it was so vague that people didn't know what to do with it. But William Seabrook came along a few years later and wrote The Magic Island. And he was visiting Haiti, and he tried to get into the voodoo religion and visit with the voodoo priests and learn more about what they do. And he ultimately came up with the definition of a zombie, of somebody that was rising and being forced to work forever. And really, his definition is what influences our present day concept of zombie. And he did discuss cannibalism and that zombies could be cannibals, which brings all of that into, sort of where we are today. After Seabrook and all, we get into Pulp Fiction, which I thought was fun. It's called Pulp Fiction because it was printed on cheap paper. It was mass produced. And so 30 million Americans were reading 150 titles in the 1930s. I thought was kind of interesting. So zombies get picked up in Pulp Fiction pretty quickly. They follow in the footsteps of Dracula and Frankenstein. And basically those stories got rewritten with the voodoo priest as either the Dracula or the Frankenstein, right? So they just mimicked that storyline instead of sort of a new storyline. But ultimately, zombies don't have that classic referent. They don't have the, Middle European story of Dracula or Frankenstein. And so that's why the zombie story can become so amorphous and can get morphed in so many ways, is because it doesn't have this rock solid book that we're going to refer back to for the story, right? And ultimately, they live in Pulp Fiction for a while, but they ultimately make their debut in movies in 1932, which we're going to come back to in just a minute. We're going to get to the definite that we're going to look at some of these movies, but ultimately, the definition of zombie has morphed, right? We all know who Dracula is, right? He is a vampire. He will drink your blood, right? But when you start to look at the definition of a zombie through time, it changes a lot. So Dracula's appearance has changed, and whether or not he, is sexually active or has children or I don't know what has come and gone, but zombies really have changed a lot. So initially it's the reanimated corpse that's brought back for the purpose of slave labor, right? Focusing on the original sort of origin. Then we eventually get to this slow, reanimated, flesh-hungry corpse that moves in a mob, so Night of the Living Dead, but it's hearkening back to the cannibalistic stories of zombies. And now we've morphed into some infected humans who've lost the ability to recognize people or take care of their basic needs, right? And so we're getting to 28 Days and World War Z. And in some ways, it is drawing on those old accounts of zombies that are mindless and unable to control themselves, right? But ultimately, they do share common themes of mindlessness, loss of freedom or will, and they're driven or controlled by some force that is beyond themselves, right? And ultimately, zombies have changed through time as we look at these movies. And really, it comes down to because our fears as a society have changed. And so the way that zombies are portrayed and everything has changed through time. So it's kind of a fun foray, in my opinion. So White Zombie is the first zombie movie. It came out in 1932, and a woman was turned into a zombie while visiting Haiti, ultimately, I believe, to become the lover of a not-so-nice sorcerer or something. But a lot of the commentary in the movie really focuses on fear of the exotic and fear of the unknown, fear of foreigners, fear of the natives in Hawaii, and fear of powerful people becoming, controlled for profit. There's a particular line in which Neil says that Madeline would be better off dead than in the hands of the natives. So they're, really sort of hearkening back to these fears of other, not us. And then there definitely is the underlying storyline of women as the weaker sex. They're just as susceptible to voodoo as the natives, while the men have stayed strong. At the time of this movie, we are beginning the Great Depression, and we're definitely deeply entrenched in the isolationism post-World War I. So we have a lot of fears of the other. We're fearful of foreigners and outsiders. We're afraid of being controlled by others, as was starting to happen in Germany and other places, right? And so that's where these ideas are sort of feeding off of. And there's definitely an idea that we're going to win the day. Haiti was possessed by America at the time, so there was a lot of fear and superstition related to Haiti, and again, the original uprising in Haiti of the slaves and other things. I Walk with Zombie came out in 1941, and then Voodoo Island in 58, and so they continue this idea of a dark, malevolent individual attacking the pure white society that is, being portrayed. Revenge of the Zombies. Sometimes, we just put it right on the nose, and we point out exactly what we're afraid of. And in particular, Revenge of the Zombies was a German mad scientist trying to create zombies in the swamps of Louisiana. We were right on the cusp of World War II, and still the residual fears of World War I. And then that also brings the voodoo lore from Louisiana because of the connection to the islands. And again, women are still the most susceptible in the whole thing. So definitely, it was really on the nose on this one. Before, it was much more subtle, our fears of Germany and others. And this one, it's a German that's doing it to us, right? Soon after, there's a big change in the movies. Prior to 45, we only have like 1 or 2 or 3 zombies, and they're just sort of, following around doing what their master tells them to do. But then we get a massive shift after this into hordes of zombies, and there is a reason. And that is because in 1945, we entered Auschwitz and other concentration camps and realized the magnitude of what had occurred. 60,000 starving prisoners and 13,000 unburied corpses in some places, and the factories that were used to create them, followed by Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the atomic bomb and the large numbers of dead and the fact that you could just wipe out an entire civilization in a moment. And so you have these mass numbers of dead, and a lot of fear. And then at the same time, so we're coming out of that and going into the post-World War II era, in which we really are getting into the American way, right? And we're making changes in farming and production, mass production, moving into big cities, consumer economy. Everybody needs that kitchen. Everybody needs that Cadillac, right? And it was American to buy the latest, the newest, the biggest. You had to have the same thing as your neighbors. Everybody needs to be the same, right? We have to conform. And so you're starting to see sort of a mindless mass fear in this. And then we get into the 50s with the Korean War and the human wave and just being overpowered by the large numbers of troops, as well as the fear of brainwashing, which gets us into the mindless, controlled component again. During this time, we kind of see like an ebb in zombie movies a bit. They're sort of like on the B market. But we do get several non-zombie movies that are playing on the same theme, including Invasion of the Body Snatchers and then the Stepford Wives. That movie scared the ever-loving bejesus out of me. But they don't become mindless, but they are possessed by another, or they're following a crowd. So it's not quite zombie, but it's in the vein. But really, George Romero resurrects, literally, the zombie theme. And he's really commenting ultimately on the American way. And he really picks up on this mass death, mass horde concept with his movie Night of the Living Dead. So we have a space satellite that was destroyed, and there's radiation, and the radiation reaches Earth, and everybody rises up. And the movie repeatedly mentions that the zombies look like normal people and that the acts of violence are random and horrific, and you should avoid suspicious strangers. And this is ultimately hearkening back to the random violence of war, and especially the Korean and Vietnam wars, in which it was not a standard military fight. And so people were just very, these random acts were terrifying. It's difficult to distinguish the bad guys from the good guys. And then obviously the fear of radiation poisoning, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the atomic nuclear plants, etc. And ultimately you had this mass horde of dead. There's not 2 or 3 zombies. There are hundreds of zombies throughout. The lead character in this movie, though, actually was a black man, which was very interesting. It was revolutionary at the time. And Romero says he didn't do it on purpose. But that's kind of a side note. And it's not outright stated that race is a factor in the movie, but it becomes very clear as you watch it, because they begin to infight a great deal. And even though he's presenting very rational, valid ideas, they don't want to listen to him. And they really want to preserve the norms of who's going to be in charge and who's going to make the decisions. And in the end, ironically, he is the only survivor. And when he exits the house and the police are coming across the field, they kill him. And definitely the weak woman theme continues throughout. But ultimately, this starts that massification of zombies, and it has the cannibalism component. They start biting people left and right. And so still trying to figure out how they did it, because their teeth aren't right, but someday Romero and I will have to discuss it. During the Night of the Living Dead, we're in the Vietnam War. Guerrilla warfare, attacks can happen anywhere. Everywhere is a battlefield. We're in the space race with Russia. We've just had the nuclear bombs. And in these cases, indecisiveness or non-action is viewed as unacceptable and could result in death. And so, you have to be decisive. You need to make a plan. You can't, wait around. Otherwise, it will result in utter chaos and catastrophe. And there's also obviously race riots as interracial marriages being legalized. So you're hearkening back to the tension in the movie. A few years later, Romero continues this, and he decides to get a little more on the nose with it and sets his zombie movie in a mall, in a shopping mall. Which started to open in the 1960s and were met obviously with widespread enthusiasm and in some cases mass hysteria that resulted in some people getting trampled and such. So Dawn of the Dead came in 1978 and was set in a mall, and ultimately the characters in the movie spend a great deal of time trying to accumulate wealth, and who has the most things while they're also trying to fight off the zombies in the movie. Comedy is also, it's meant to be a parody or to satirize our behaviors. We often poke fun at taboos or social conventions. It can turn a situation around and make it help us re-examine our reality, right? And zombies are right there in it. Zombies on Broadway was the first zombie-com, as they call it, but it was not the last. Zombies on Broadway was in 1945, so it was right in the beginning of the heyday, and it was a spoof. They had the zombie hut, and with the tiki hut craze and the zombie drink that had come out of the World's Fair. And if you drink too much rum, you become zombified, right? And so Zombies on Broadway sort of killed the zombie movie for a little while. So again, this is right as we're into the World War period, and then we get the next phase of information. Like I said, things sort of slowed on the zombie front, and then Romero picks it back up again after that time period. But don't fear, they're still out there. These movies continue. And just as the zombies in the more serious movies represent our fears in many ways, the comedies really do sort of start to poke fun at them and start to poke fun at just how unreasonable some things are. So Shaun of the Dead, which I do love, is obviously a spoof on Dawn of the Dead. And it's a British zombie-com because, everybody's got to follow the Americans. And it's a commentary on the monotony of daily life. In some ways, this is the time when we're in the war on terror. And in some ways, a lot of people just continued on with their lives and didn't even notice that there was a war waging around the world, right? And so it was sort of poking fun at this, it's every day, no big deal. The zombies are wandering by. And they even say, like, let's go down to the Winchester and have a nice cold pint and wait for this all to blow over, right? They're just going to go have a beer and wait for the zombies to hustle off. I don't know. Zombieland in 2009 gets into survival and isolation, but also the made family concept when we start to see this coming out. And they say, we had hope, we had each other, and without people, well, you might as well be a zombie, right? So you shouldn't isolate, you need people, and sometimes you end up having to pick the people that are going to be your, survival. Survival past the expiration date. There's all kinds of Twinkie references in this movie. And the need to look forward to something, no matter how absolutely stupid it is. They're driving across the country to go to an amusement park so that they can ride a roller coaster. And it's good fun at the end of the day. In the 2000s, we pick up zombies again, and this time they move a lot more quickly. They're no longer shuffling through the mall. Now they run. Now they're very savage. They're far more violent. But we do see a shift from this annihilationist view of like, if you don't act, you will die, to much more of a survivalist view, and like focusing on how will the survivors survive? How do they do this together? How are we going to save society? But you still see a lot of the fears going on. So there's obviously the fears of disease, medical experimentation, the distrust of science, Resident Evil, all of that right there, all those movies. It's biohazards and distrust of large corporations, et cetera. 28 Days Later, it plays on some of the fears of what were going on in the Iraq War, especially when you watch the scenes with the soldiers when the survivors show up to the sort of where the military is. And there's a lot of things going on in those scenes that harken back to some of the things coming out of the news from Iraq. And then I Am Legend, which I think they're vampires, not zombies, but that's my opinion. And then obviously the Walking Dead series has really taken off. World War Z originally was a book in 2006 and then was made into a movie in 2013. And this is obviously heavily linked to the global pandemic, SARS, H1N1. And pointing out that like the traditional military strategy is not effective against these unconventional threats. And so again, in some ways, we're hearkening back to those fears of, Vietnam and Korea, but now it's Afghanistan and Iraq. And the fact that what we do with our military normally isn't going to work in this same war. And so we're scared of what do we do? We're also disillusioned with the government and the institutions and, widespread chaos after like Katrina. And so, figuring out how we can, work through all of this. There's definitely an over-reliance on technology. And so there's a lot of focusing back on people that make it without the technology, right? And the need for international cooperation. The movie missed that a fair bit, but the book apparently really like harps on the need for like, we can't isolate ourselves as a country. We need to have others to survive. Japanese or Asian zombies, not all societies have zombies. Some view the dead as never leaving. But if you don't practice those rituals properly, they'll stick around, which is the vengeful spirit, the vengeful ghost. The Ring movie is an example of that with the girl, the hair, that's scary. But again, we're not going to miss out on $1. And so Korea put out the Train to Busan in 2016. And it's actually a really interesting movie because if you watch it closely, the first people that die and die the most violently are the ones that were incredibly disrespectful to the elders when this whole situation began. And so, it's definitely harking back to that Asian concept of like care for the elderly, et cetera. So, and in the end, I found it interesting because it came out of Korea that they're trapped on a train and they're forced to work with only the people and resources they have. They can't get anything from the outside, right? And so it's sort of, the Korean society situation. But it's a very interesting movie. More recently, we get into senescent zombies. So they are no longer mindless. Warm Bodies, Revival, Santa Clarita Diet, Zombies on Disney, and The Girl with All the Gifts. Some have argued that this coincides with the rise of millennials and the decline of the baby boomer generation, and sort of the whole degenerating bodies concept and debilitating conditions. And so even though their bodies are starting to fail them, they may still have their minds, actually. And so you are sort of senescent, but not totally there. And then there's also sort of this fear of a loveless, soulless, isolationist world. Some of the zombies are managed or cured by love. I'm so kind of like how we're having to care for our elderly parents sometimes. Others have feelings too, so we should, take care of the less fortunate. We shouldn't be quick to judge. And incorporating change, not fighting it, right? Kind of hearkening back to Romero and, how they just adamantly wanted to keep the social norms. And in the end, it resulted in them dying. And so you see some of those same themes in these movies of we just need to include them. Otherwise, we're not going to survive. So kind of, same storylines again and again, but it's kind of fun. But another interesting thing is that zombies have become increasingly dehumanized with time. And it's more, in the beginning, we talked more about who they were, right? They rose up out of the graves. They were the father, they were the uncle, they were the brother, through time. And now it becomes much more of like, how are we going to kill them? So we don't even care who they are anymore. We just need to kill them. And it's especially when you look at some of the early zombie games and then the later ones, when you shift to first-person shooter modes, and the fact that like the early games you had to like solve riddles and you had to get places, but the later games it's much more how many can you kill. And so you can see how these games and this dehumanizing of zombies plays into some of those themes of isolation and bringing people in and loving them and et cetera. Some have argued that we are already zombies due to technology. I'm pretty sure my 2 children over there are. And the movie The Cell uses technology to turn people into zombies. The 0-hour contract is essentially zombie labor. It's keeping people in a state of limbo until needed and then put to work, which is kind of scary. The Walking Dead implies that we're actually already zombies, just waiting to come alive. I'm not quite sure, but so kind of fun to think about what is the next iteration of zombies in our society. Does anybody have the next blockbuster movie idea in here? That's what I need to know. I would like to invest now. So we'll do some what if, right? So archaeology, right? That's what we're here for. We study past civilizations and peoples through material culture and artifacts. And ultimately, we're trying to reconstruct things like political systems based on iconography or village structures, religious beliefs, trade systems. How far away did things come from, right? And in nearly every zombie movie, civilization falls. And eventually the zombies usually die due to starvation or decomposition. And very few movies, though, actually depict the outcome, right? We rarely see the other side. And so this was kind of a fun talk that I would have with the students when I was teaching the class of like, have you ever, how many of you read the book or seen the book, Motel of Mysteries? And it was basically, it's a spoof on the discovery of King Tut's tomb. And the hotel is called Tutankhamun. And there's the guy is dead on the bed and he's looking at the TV and they're like, this must be the altar. And they end up wearing the toilet seat as a ceremonial object. So it's great fun. So my students had to read that. And then they each had to pick a movie and discuss, like, if we were archaeologists in the future, what might you find to tell us about this zombie society? And so it was kind of fun to see what the kids came up with. Bioarchaeology or forensic anthropology, we examine the skeletons for markers to look for age, sex, ancestry, stature, individualizing characteristics. Ultimately, we're trying to, identify people. We also look at how bodies are buried so that we can understand past cultures and past beliefs, right? Putting the sickle on the neck or stones on their feet, right? And we often look for evidence of disease. So syphilis, for example, you see saber shins and the stellate lesion patterns on the skull, spinal fusions and tuberculosis, bone cancer. But all these diseases, you have to live for a while for them to show up on your skeleton. But things like plague or Black Death, smallpox, Ebola, they tend to kill too fast. You don't tend to see skeletal markers of them. And so we often in those instances find mass graves of people that look healthy, but they all had died of something, very catastrophic. And so that's sort of the fun thing to think about is what would we see in these zombie bodies. Night of the Living Dead, the little girl is bitten and becomes a zombie. So it's not clear if she was infected or if she died and then rose. But so we had a discussion of like, do you think we would see skeletal signs of this zombie disease in these various movies? And it depended a lot on which movie you were watching and like how long it took them to become zombies and how long they shuffled around for. Was sort of the consensus. But I do think that this guy down there, that would be a pretty noticeable skeletal modification that we might pick up on in the archaeological record. And then forensic anthropology, bioarchaeology, we look at trauma a lot, right? How were these people injured? So ante-mortem trauma before death, you often see signs of healing, broken bones that are healed. You're probably not going to see that in the zombie situation, right? Because, maybe that was their before life, but I'm pretty sure their bones don't heal based on all of the ones I've seen dragging their limbs around. So I don't think we're going to find ante-mortem trauma healing in zombies. Peri-mortem, it's around the time of death. There's no healing. Things like stab wounds, gunshot wounds. This is might be more like, how they died to become a zombie, kind of like Night of the Living Dead. Maybe they died in a car crash and then they were later raised up, or World War Z, etc. And then postmortem is after the death, so no healing. Things tend to break in weird ways. And so you get animal scavenging, dismemberment when you chop bodies up or burn them or trample them. This is definitely going to give us some clues about, how people were trying to get rid of them, right? It's going to definitely tell us all the ways that they tried, and eventually which ones were successful, right? Because I guess they're down. So good old projectile trauma. It's just some fun slides looking at rifle injury. We've got, let's see, a 38. Oops, sorry. We got a 38 caliber gunshot wound, which is kind of like what she's using in Resident Evil. We've got a lot of rifles in zombie movies. That would not be my choice. I need something shorter. Shotgun up there. That is very effective. That to the head. But if you're too far away, that's the far one over there. It doesn't do a lot of damage, so you need to be sure you're very close to the zombie when you shoot them in the head with the rifle. And then this poor guy got nailed in the head with a nail gun, but he's still alive, actually. So I make sure your nails are longer, I think is the moral to the story right there. Blunt force trauma. If you want to wield the hammer, it can be a very effective tool to protect yourself, or the Walking Dead baseball bat of chainmail, or the crowbar. I always love a good crowbar. So this was actually a famous case that Dr. Maples, who was a forensic anthropologist at the University of Florida, did. These were crowbars, and Maples used to go down to the hardware store and he would buy a big piece of pine, and then he would buy all of the tools that he thought had caused the injury. And so he bought, like 27 crowbars, and he would whack the pine with all of the crowbars until he found the crowbar that matched. And then he would take all the crowbars back to the store and keep the one that did it. And then he would go tell the police which crowbar they were looking for. So I've actually done something similar with saws. And I had to explain to somebody in Lowe's that I was shopping for saws to cut up pig bones. So that was a rough conversation, but we solved the case. Sharp force. Let's see, we've got... I think that one's an arrow to the head. We've got a knife to the head. Those are knives to the sternum. This is a chainsaw here, and this is a good old, very effective machete. So you can actually see they sort of whacked the ear off first, hit a little low, and then they got where they needed to. So helping you pick your weapon of choice. I would say thermal damage is not advisable. It takes too long. People rarely actually burn to death. You usually die of smoke inhalation first. And bones will actually change color depending on how long they've been burning. It's how we can sometimes figure out how long a body was burning, whether or not they were alive, whether or not the body was fully fleshed or skeletonized before the fire, etc. And so you do have burning in zombies, but clearly he's still running back there. So I would try to go for one of the former, more effective methods. And again, we're not going to miss out on a buck. So there are numerous companies out there in which you can buy yourself zombie bullets. I actually did have a case once when I was a medical examiner, death investigator, of a man that was shot with zombie bullets. They were regular bullets. They just had green dye on the end of them. But he was dead. So but he wasn't a zombie, so I don't know the ins and outs. But you can buy a bunker plan and make sure that your home is zombie safe. And you can obviously join any number of survival groups that will tell you how to live through the apocalypse. And the CDC actually really bought in on this and used it to discuss how to prepare for an emergency. And they talked about having emergency plans and having food and who to contact and how to take care of somebody that's injured, you know, and not get bitten. But it was very fun. And then the 10 types of zombies and how to kill them dead. You have crawlers and bloaters and the seductive zombie, if you're interested, and the military grade one. And we got the kitty ghouls. So, you know, I think the limbless wonder, it's almost like, what's his name in Monty Python? Oh. He's like, come closer and I'll bite you. So that is the end, or, you know, is it? If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them best I can.
I'm interested in the Caribbean because this story pretty much starts with Haiti and the people from Africa. So two parts. There must be a culture, African culture, that's, you know, all this about. But in the Caribbean, I was kind of taught that all the Caribbean islands had histories of cannibalism before this discovery. That, in other words, the original people from the Caribbean, which were called the Caribs.
Right. So twofold. So the African culture is where you get sort of the concept of the sorcerer or the witch or something that can curse you and control you. Okay. And so they bring that concept, but they don't really like have the concept of zombie in the way that it is, but you can be controlled or cursed. And then when they come to the islands, I think it's because they're picking up the Catholicism and the rising of Jesus from the dead, as well as just the fear of perpetual slavery. And that's where it morphs into this concept of a zombie that we know. And yes, again, there's numerous cultures around the world, including in the Caribbean and the Papua New Guinea and the islands all over the place, Europe, everywhere, of cannibalism. Again, it's often linked to, you know, sort of the ritual preservation of your family lineage, right? You're taking a part of your loved one and making it a part of you.
Like the baby fingers?
It can be. There's a lot of variation in it. And sometimes it just is the good old, you know, I am a warrior and I shall steal your power thing. So yes, there was definitely instances of that in the Caribbean, throughout the United States prior to the arrival of Europeans. And so I'm sure that in some ways that amalgamated then into this concept of the zombie and all of that thing that got built into this storyline of why we should be fearful of these people. Anybody else? Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, the first sets of slides I was showing you was probably vampire burials, with the belief that they were going to rise from the dead for various reasons. There is a lot of history of, I think in some ways, again, we have the same story, right? We have a powerful individual who is killing people, and maybe or maybe he didn't drink blood, but it eventually gets morphed into the teeth and the biting people and the living forever. And in some ways, it could have been in a way similar to the identity situation with zombies, in which maybe there was, you know, Vlad the vampire, and, you know, 200 years later, it's still Vlad the vampire, but it's actually, you know, his great-great-grandson. And he's just, you know, taken the name and the behavior. I'm not as much of a vampire expert at the moment. I'm working on it, but
next year.
Yeah, next year. But the zombies, definitely the early zombie movies and the early zombie Pulp Fiction, you know, sort of took the Dracula story to frame their stories to get them out there. So that's the connection to this.
That's American and European ideas. Do they do the same thing in the Orient?
Well, as I had mentioned, they typically, in a lot of the Asian countries, they don't have the same concept. It's more the the ghost will not go away concept, and that if you don't perform the death rituals correctly or you don't honor them the way that you're supposed to, which is why a lot of cultures have the concept of like going back and visiting the grave regularly to make sure it's clean and cared for and they're not alone, so that they, stay quiet as opposed to becoming malevolent and coming after you and harming you. So again, it's the same idea of not completing a cycle or of a spirit or a person being unsettled or out of rest, but it's not the same physical embodiment concept that we have. But again, they're coming up with zombie movies because they're not going to miss out on $1. So, yeah.
There's also been a thing that's common is that there are diseases or situations where a person can seem to be dead.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what resulted from that was that people were always afraid of being buried alive.
Yes.
So they would put a string down to the coffin with a bell on the top. And someone would wait around to see if the bell got rung.
Yes.
Ringer.
Yes, a dead ringer. Yes, and that's what some of the other those Haitian zombie stories. Some of them are a concept that maybe the person was unconscious, such as the Adeline one, who may have been having an epileptic seizure and was dead, but really wasn't. And at the end of the day, they couldn't bury her for various reasons, and so she may have just woken up and walked away. So yeah, no, it's a very common fear, obviously, that perpetuates from Europe and the Black Plague and all kinds of things. So that's why I guess we're going to give you an eyeless needle so that you don't get bored in there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.